Hey everyone, welcome to episode 37 of the Ceres podcast. Today's guest is Mark Thomson, who's the ambassador to Scotland for Glenfiddich malt whisky. We talk about what it's like to work for not only a family business, but one that's been in existence since 1887. So if you like whisky, maybe this could be the perfect job for you. Mark is a really interesting chap. There's something quite, 007 about him. I hope we bust some of the basic myths that you hear about whisky, but we also get to talk about the wider whisky industry and why whisky is really important to get right in hospitality. I really found the topic of whisky really interesting because it's generally shrouded behind mystery and so many so-called rules that accompany it that puts people off from drinking it. For those of you that don't know who picks up the podcast bills, then head over to worldofceres.com. We've been updating our blogs and putting out transcripts of the podcasts, episode articles, updating recipes for the fish cake base mix, mushy pea seasoning, and so much more. Recently, we've added a shop spotlight with Gem Octem and Charlie Collins from Friedels in Leicester, so be sure to have a read. I just want to thank you for all the support and kind words. So many people coming in and listening to the Ceres podcast from the beginning and playing catch up. In a few weeks, I'll be doing a solo podcast on my own and a podcast with Andrew Crook from the National Federation of Fish Fryers. So if you have any questions for either of us, just send them over to me by email or private message on social media. If you're new to this, then hit subscribe. This way, you get episodes downloaded straight to your chosen device. I hope you enjoyed this episode with Mark Thomson, and don't forget to follow him on Instagram. Just look for Single Malt Mark. Hi Mark, welcome to the Ceres podcast.
Hi there, how are you doing?
Not too bad. Thank you for having me in your lovely home.
Oh, you're more than welcome.
Your kitchen area is just, there's cables just absolutely everywhere. I don't think...
They're yours, not mine.
They are
just
mine.
For clarity.
Yeah, just for clarity. I've made an absolute mess of your lovely kitchen. So, just to introduce you, Mark, you are the ambassador to Scotland for Glenfiddich malt whisky.
That is correct.
Just start us off, actually. I've just changed the question in my head, but just tell us, what's the day-to-day like for someone that does your job?
Well, it changes constantly. As an ambassador, I've been ambassador for Glenfiddich now for coming up for 5 years, and worked with the company a couple of years prior to that. And ultimately, you're an educator, so it can be any sort of forward-facing or customer-facing interaction. So that could be hosting a dinner, a whiskey paired dinner, training bartenders, hoteliers, helping set up bars, whiskey lists, podcasts, radio, television, newspaper articles, that kind of thing. So it's anywhere where you're trying to bridge the gap between the whiskey in the bottle and the whiskey in the glass. You're helping people understand the differences between the products, how it's made. And it's such a varied role because every group of individuals you sit down in front of, they have a different need. You know, it's whether they want to know how tall our stills are, how big they are, or how technically complete the distillery is, or just what the whiskey tastes like in the glass. So you have to adjust, the level of detail you go into and how you talk.
It's a difficult product to market well because there's so many fixed obstacles on purpose. So for example, you can't advertise in normal places. You probably can't advertise on TV, but before a certain time, I'm guessing. It's one of the most highly taxed products in the world. It's frowned upon by many. How do you get people to sort of how do you get them to understand whiskey from that point?
It can be quite challenging. Typically, when you sit down with someone and they have a negativity towards whiskey, there's usually a reason for it. There's usually something in there that, I overindulged at college once, I can't stomach it, I can't even smell it. And I'm sure I wouldn't be the first ambassador that gets quite excited when they hear that, because that to us is a challenge. The human brain has a wonderful way of protecting the body, and especially when people say, I get one smell of it and I can't stand it. And I just want the opportunity sometimes to rake around in the whiskey cupboard, pull out 5 or 6 different whiskies, sit them down and say, let me just take you through these one by one. And let's find the one that's there for you. It's a bit like dating. Not many people give up on their first date just because it didn't work out very well. They don't say, that's it, I'm off the human race. You have to go back and, take things easy, work out what you actually need and want. And I've often said there's a whiskey out there for everyone. They just haven't found it yet. So for us, the approach, the marketing, how we talk to people is all very considered based on the individual in front of us at the time.
We mentioned earlier, we're going to touch on social media later on. When I go on your website or anything, the first thing it says to me is, how old are you? The sort of approach on social media is very different, because you have to say, essentially, if you're going to follow this account, you've got to be over 80. Do you see a lot of sort of like irresponsible things like that anyway? Like, or has it changed a bit now? Like,
I think in general, there's a lot of youngsters, if we say, that are abstaining from alcohol completely. The binge drinking culture of the 80s and 90s and early 2000s has slowed somewhat. People have a much more healthy lifestyle. We live in a world which is critical of overindulgence. So I think we see people drinking less, but drinking better. And as a brand with a lot of respect and heritage and history, we're sort of the go-to.
Start at the beginning a little bit. How does one get to be an ambassador? What was the sort of trajectory there?
If I told you that, I'd lose my job. I think there's a number of different ways people can come at it now. And I'm asked this question quite a lot. In fact, just had a message come through on Instagram with exactly that question. How do I get your job, basically? So I took what would be called a traditional trajectory. Qualified by experience. I grew up drinking whiskey. I had a desire to find out more about it, but actually wine was my first starting point, working in bars and restaurants in my late teens. I really got into wine, started collecting wines, sat my wine exams, the WSETs, and then got a little bit bored with it because I suddenly realised you need to be aware of whether it rained in France in October, or wasn't so much about the vintages and, having to change your attitude to wine each year if it was a good vintage or a bad vintage. And I thought, you know what? It's getting a bit poncy as well. Everyone is starting to get into this. You've got to think this is late 90s. There were wine bars and still in existence. And I just found it a little bit stuffy. And I realised that I was living in London at the time. I lived down there for 16 years. And I realised actually I had a lot of knowledge about whiskey, but there weren't individuals out there talking about it in a modern way. Go along to whiskey tastings and look at these guys standing up, and I won't name names.
Oh, they're still around.
Yeah, they are still around. And I'd think, you wouldn't find this isn't entertaining. This is a lecture, and it's not interactive, and it's not fun. And I thought there's got to be a different way of doing this. And having worked in restaurants and hotels and trained a lot of staff and brigades, public speaking thing I didn't shy away from that. So I started to develop a tasting program, a consumer program, which was really successful. I was doing 500 people a month, and I worked with a lot of the brands and really got to know their brands. So I'd ask various different whiskey companies, can you support this program? I'm getting out to all these individuals. It's a nice educational program, tied it in with a retailer as well, so there was an actual tangible result at the end of each of the tastings that we did, and ran that for a few years before moving slightly sideways from that and just becoming more of a consultant for these brands. So because I'd worked the London market quite heavily, there were a lot of new brands coming in, gin in particular, who would, whiskey companies with gin as well, would say, right, we've got this new gin, we'd really love you to help us for a few months seed this into the on-trade of London, which I could do. The network had built up. So from there, more of a consultancy side and an ambassador for hire, if you like. If a company couldn't put an ambassador somewhere, they needed something done, dinner hosted, then they would call on myself. So over those years, William Grant and Sons were a company I'd worked with quite a lot. And when the role for Glenfiddich came up, I jumped at it. It'd been a brand that I've known all my life. Drank Glenfiddich with my grandfather many times. For me, I knew all about the company, the heritage behind it, still family owned. Just everything rang true for me. So I gave up all the other businesses and focused just on this. Of course, nowadays, you can go to college and study. I actually do have a marketing diploma as well, but you can study business and marketing and come in through a graduate scheme and work your way up through there. Or you can be plucked from obscurity from behind a bar if you have the right attitude and a little more strings to your bow than just a drinks creator. Yeah. It's quite a diverse role.
We're going to touch on this a little bit about the image of whiskey, but those boring people, let's say, or the people that sort of clouded it with mystery and I don't know what to say, what the best way to say it, but they tried to make it look snobbish, didn't they, about the whiskey? And would you say that the new breed of ambassadors have probably most of their job is to just get rid of that.
Absolutely. In fact, I'd say even myself, probably 30% of what I do is re-educating stereotype that we've created, which is a kind of historical issue, stemming all from the fact that single malt is not something that's been around very long. It surprises people. Whisky has been in the UK, certainly, or in Scotland. The first mention of it was in 1494. It was actually called aquavitae, the water of life, which is also where the word whisky comes from. In the old Scots tongue, that's uskabe. And no one could pronounce that. It was actually shortened to uska, which over time became whiskey. But the Scots didn't invent it, neither did the Irish. We perhaps perfected it, both Celtic nations, and raised it to what it is today. But the truth of the matter is it came in from the Middle East. They now are excavating artefacts in China 3,000 years BC, which they can only relate to distillation. But the Middle East, Persia, alchemists in the 3rd and 4th century, absolute nailing it. Not using it to imbibe, they were using it for tinctures, preserves, perfumes.
Okay.
And then we all came trudging in during the Holy Wars. And of course we had our monks with us who knew about alcohol because it will naturally occur. Yeast is all around. So they could brew beer, but they had no idea on how to distill and get that alcohol higher. So with interaction in the Middle East, they travel back into the West and bring with them those teachings, and slowly it catches on. But the interesting thing is, traditional whiskey would have been perfectly clear. We certainly wouldn't have waited around for it to mature and mellow in cask. It would have been no time, off the still. As if you look around the world, many nations and countries still drink that way. So akavit, eau de vie, they're clear, they're unaged spirit from grain or fruit. But we would have in Scotland perhaps softened it slightly because it comes off the still at a fairly punchy ABV, usually between 70 and 75% from a pot still. And we'd add in some herbs or spices, mellow it down, add a bit of water and drink it. Clearac was the old name for it. And then comes in blending and mellowing and the creation of blended whiskies, which interestingly, back in the 1950s, a bottle of single malt, it wasn't called that then, but a single whiskey distillery's malting of barley into whiskey would have been cheaper than a blend because it was seen as an ingredient. It's a bit like someone walking into a restaurant and asking for a pizza and the waiter coming out with a tomato and going, "This is the best part. You have to," and you're like, "But I want the whole thing." So I say, blended whiskey is a little bit like that. It's an amalgamation to create a wonderful flavour, building on the different characteristics of different ingredients. The Grant family in the 60s decided to change all that and actually created something called the straight malt in 1961 to 63. And we sent it across to America. And it was the first time single malt had been actively marketed. And we put a lot of weight behind it. Of course, with that, the marketing that came along with it were posters such as, "Sit down when you drink Glenfiddich, you'll never stand for another blend again." Bearing in mind our blended whiskey, which built our company, was Grant Standfast, so it was almost cannibalising from within.
Was that because they saw the market shifting?
I think the family understood that the product that we had, which was a small home market of 3 or 4%, the majority of our liquid went off for blending. But the product that was that we kept back, was of such good quality that we thought, there's something here. Now, of course, with our success in the early 60s, every other company that could do it did it. And with their marketing out came this, how do you elevate something into a position of respect? And the only way to do it is to create rules and regulations around it. And it became very part of the whiskey drinker's remit. Well, I know how to drink it. I like adding in this and I never do this. And the worst thing is that they would start to educate other people on this when they saw them ordering a whiskey at a bar. "Oh, you're doing it wrong." "Oh, it's my whiskey, I can do what I want." No, this is how you drink single malt. You must be male in a Chesterfield next to a fire, preferably in tweed or tartan, and it's only after dinner. It was terrible.
So many rules.
So I think through that period of time, lots of individuals, and again, this comes down to social media, but lots of individuals, let's say you're 35 to 40-year-old today, was probably introduced to whiskey from a family member, someone that's their father, their grandfather, aunt, whatever it might be. But those individuals were only ever told how to drink whiskey from the marketing from the 70s and the 80s. Yeah. So it's bad information all the way through. So I still have a lot of people that will come up to me and say, "Oh, I only ever do this with it." And I was like, "Why? Why wouldn't you just do what you wanted with it? Because that's how you're supposed to drink it. When we do trade shows and I'm doing cocktail demonstrations, people are coming up and say, you can't do that. You cannot put a single malt in a cocktail. Why? Okay, you're not supposed to. Okay, I'm sure I've got permission to do this. And technically, for the first 90 years of our existence, Glenfiddich went into cocktails, went into blends. As soon as there's 3 ingredients, it's a cocktail. So it's changing that perception, but it's a smaller amount because you've got a younger generation coming through who are gaining their whiskey knowledge from social media, from ambassadors with a different attitude, not from marketing. The marketing, if you look at it now, very rarely, in fact now, it's actually flipped the opposite way where it's always female-led and it's about breaking down stereotypes and bursting through walls and being maverick. And so the entire way the whiskey world communicates now is far more fitting to be the person you want to be, do what you want, get your information, understand what it is, and act accordingly.
So whilst we're here, let's deal with one myth, and I think it's sort of fitting. So anything labelled single is better than blended.
Not true. The art and skill of the distillery malt masters in our case, or master blenders in the case of a blender, is equal. They are absolute craftsmen when it comes to finding the nuances of one product, adding it to another and creating something wonderful. Now, there are blended whiskies which are, of course, entry-level price point into the market, but there are blended whiskies at over £200 a bottle, and there's everything in between. So I think when you say blended whiskey versus single malt, many people will automatically think of 16, 17, £18 blend versus a £35 single malt. Now that's slightly unfair, but if you look at certain blends which are beautifully put together, I've tried many, and been astounded by how beautiful they are and how well crafted they are. And therefore the single malt is many of the single malts actually are also, I'm going to use the word carefully, they are blends, not in the technical term, but they are marriages of different casks.
That's right, because I think a lot of people's misconception might be that they come from one cask.
Yeah, no. If they are, it will state on the label they are a single cask whiskey. They tend to be slightly more expensive, but if you take Glenfiddich, for example, the first, what have we got? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. The first 9 products in our range are all an amalgamation of casks, where you're taking, because every cask will flavour the spirit completely differently, not massively differently, but 2 American oak casks filled on the same day with spirit, taken out 12 years later, you will notice a difference between one and the other.
Even me.
Yes, even you. So the skill of our malt master in our distillery is to find the differences between those casks, bring them together, add a little bit of a different type of cask. In relation to our 12-year-old, we use American oak and we use European oak. They're very different, the same type of wood, but a different species. So you have light, delicate, fruity notes from American oak, low tannins, good wood sugars. When you get your European casks, they tend to be a little bit drier, spicier, more tannin. And you use them in relation to our 12-year-old, they're used almost as seasoning. So the majority of a bottle of 12-year-old is made from American oak, but there's about 15-20% of the end of the bottle is from European oak. And those together could be 500 different casks. And Brian Kinsman, our malt master, has selected those casks, assembled them together, married them together to create a consistent product. So even a single malt is made up typically from a number of casks. In exactly the same way that blender for another company is sitting, pooling together different casks, which are really different in flavour, to create a blend. So the short answer to busting that myth, I see them on the same pedestal. I think they are different drinks for different drinkers and different occasions.
You've got to judge them like for like. So they've both got to be in the £35 bracket or the £20 bracket or whatever bracket that it is.
You can be surprised.
Yeah.
And I think that's this, when you have enough whiskey understanding and knowledge or know your own palate, you can be surprised that you can probably play around in a gap of £10 to £15 either way and still have something that
Really? What's the average week like?
Okay, let's take 2 weeks ago I flew in from Lagos, not my usual territory being the ambassador of Scotland, but I do help out with other markets now and again. So I flew in from Lagos. Monday evening, having been there since Friday and working every day through the weekend. Flew back into Heathrow 20 to 5 Tuesday morning, had a shower, had breakfast, got a train across to the city, up to a hotel there where we were filming for 2 days to do an educational piece, which is coming out in 2020. So 2 days there, flew back up to Edinburgh, had a dinner to host on the Thursday evening and at the distillery. So I went up to the distillery, looked after guests there, flew from Aberdeen back down to London, flew to Brussels, worked the weekend again, and last week I had a dinner last night. I've got a dinner tonight to host. I've got 2 meetings tomorrow about future work we're doing in 2020. I've got this weekend off, though. I'm looking forward to that. So there's constantly travelling.
So there's no 9 to 5 then?
Absolutely not. Although, and this is the part that the bartenders aspiring to be ambassadors never quite understand. And of course you work long hours in bars, of course you do, but it's the same place each time. And I've often said to people, we do have meetings in the office at 9 o'clock in the morning. And then you're still going to go out and host guests or until 1 in the morning that night. So you can rack up quite easily 70 or 80 hours in a week. And a lot of it can be quite taxing because you're not going back to the same place. And 9 to 5 is easy because you get up, you have your routine, you catch the same bus or the same train, you get into work, you know where the coffee machine is, you know what you're having for lunch. As an ambassador, every single day you're getting up, you could be in a different hotel, in a different city. You are then travelling to do a number of things, and you've got to think, right, where I'm going to get lunch today and what time am we eating. I've got that meeting later on. Now, of course, I'm not saying it's difficult, but it can be quite taxing when you see that. And you can,
a few more different challenges.
You can do 80 hours in a bar because it's the same bar you're turning up to every day. And the routine is there.
It feels like home from home.
Exactly.
You get your drinks ready, get your ice ready, and so on and so on. Yeah.
But there's no routine as an ambassador at all.
And how do you deal with like the invisible work? You're working on the train. You're working when you're at the airport. You get up in the morning. You've seen some tweets or whether it's Instagram posts because this is all work. Like how do you deal with all that as well?
Much to my girlfriend's dismay, usually immediately, which is a terrible thing. I do switch off. I do have time when I put the phones down, switch them off if I know I've got a couple of days clear, because I can be quite not obsessed, but I can be on the phone too much. But as well, it's part of the role that you do. You're a face for the brand. You're a voice. There's lots of people will ask really lovely questions which get you thinking. They come across on social. Sorry to bother you, but I was just thinking this, and I've just not. Or they'll send you cocktail recipes which are great to read, and you sit and think, God, that sounds really tasty. I'm going to try that when I get home. It becomes there's very few. In fact, there isn't anyone that we interact with that are negative. So I only deal with nice people. And that's good. That's good. You never. I don't think in the entire 5.5 years that I've looked after the brand, have I had a whiskey's terrible kind of message, because there's no.
That sort of goes elsewhere, maybe.
It does.
Not that.
It does happen.
I mean, but yeah.
Yeah. Oh, we see it on our. If we put feeds up on the larger Glenfiddich pages, you can see a lot of negativity comes up there.
To draw a parallel, if you one brand I always follow because I find it hilarious. I could lose 2 hours looking at it, but when McDonald's put a photo up, that you get, my burger didn't look like that. It looked horrible. And then the other one that's always hilarious is FedEx. I don't know why I follow FedEx on Facebook, but it's probably because I use them. But it's just you see on there, it's a photo of some guy holding a package, and then you see, what time's my package coming? I don't think this is the place you should be. Yeah. So you don't see I ordered a whiskey from Amazon.
It interests me actually, because we just don't engage. It's almost self-policing. I remember putting a post up years ago. There'd been a heat wave in London. And of course, whiskey is always seen as quite a seasonal product. So summer, I love a highball. Make a nice highball, lovely and refreshing. I like drinking whiskey, that's the thing. Sometimes neat, well, actually quite a lot neat, but so many times I'm happy to mix it around and play around with it because I like the taste of whiskey. So the company, the brand website had asked me to put up a post on chilling whiskey down, which is something I'd spoken to them about. I keep a bottle of, or certainly always keep a bottle of 12-year-old whiskey in the freezer, and it goes quite viscous, and it's just delicious.
Because it doesn't quite freeze.
No, it won't freeze because of the alcohol. Yeah. So I wrote this piece about putting whiskey in the freezer, putting the glass in the freezer as well, nice ice, getting home, taking that frosted glass out, 50 ml of whiskey in there, ice, topped up with soda, twist of lemon on the top. And it was a heat wave in London, as I said. So the whole point was to say to people, hey, look, you don't have to drink it neat. Try it like... Well, the comments that hit that post were unbelievable. It was the first time I'd seen such aggression and negativity towards what was quite a simple little suggestion. Things like, you should be sacked from your job, you don't know what you're talking about. How can they let you post that kind of rubbish? You're going straight to hell. There's a special place in hell for you. And I was like, wow. And the brand got in touch because they know I'm quite mouthy. So the brand got in touch straight away and said, don't reply. It went up on a Friday, and I remember that. And they said, just leave it the weekend and let's see what happens. What was quite interesting is that, of course, those that want to be heard, your keyboard warriors, as they call them.
They get in early, don't they?
They get in early, and it's the top of the list, and it sparks conversation. But what was quite interesting over the weekend that a number of the people that had obviously read the post had then gone on and tried the drink and came back onto the post and said, I tried it, and it's quite nice. I wouldn't choose to drink my whiskey that way all the time, which is not what I said anyway. But it was a real eye-opener for me. And since then, I have never engaged with anybody negatively.
I wonder if that was
on
like
social
a
media.
bunch of 60-year-old men in their tweeds. Like,
Yeah. And the thing is, when you get to trade shows, and I've done it a number of times before, when we launched our IPA product, which is finished in a beer cask, we actually launched it at beer shows in London on purpose. So people walk past the stand, and it's in a brown glass bottle, and they'd kind of look, and they didn't recognise it as part of our experimental series, which has created a slightly different look to the bottles, and perhaps not immediately recognisable as Glenfiddich. That was done on purpose. And they'd walk past the stand and they'd see the brown bottle with IPA stamped boldly on the front, and, I see, Glenfiddich, you're doing beer now. Well, technically we've always done beer. You then distill it, but let's not get too geeky. I said, no, it's whiskey finished in a beer cask. Oh, I don't like whiskey. Oh, okay, but you like beer? Yes, because you're at a beer show, of course you do. I said, well, why don't you give it a try? So you pour them a little a little whiskey out into the cups and hand it over. And the first thing, quite a few people I noticed picked it up to smell it and said, oh, I wasn't expecting that, because it has a hoppiness to it. It's been infused by the beer that was in the cask. So their head is more in tune to the hop note, and they pick it up quite quickly. So, I'll take a sip and I'll talk you through it. Blah, blah, blah. So, that's quite nice. And then they'd notice on the stand that we had an old-fashioned beer pump. And they said, oh, but you've got beer on your stand. I said, no, we've made old-fashions up with 15-year-old, pre-batched them and then charged them onto this. Would you like one? You could just see them, their tiny minds blowing. Wait a minute, you've put a 15-year-old single malt into a cocktail, then put it into a beer pump. It's like, yeah, because it's stopped. Yeah. So here you go. And they would try and go, that's really nice, I really like that. So initially you think, the amount of people that would walk past, no, I don't like whiskey. And they're walking away with a neat whiskey, which they're getting their head around, and a cocktail.
In some ways, whiskey's a lot more versatile than what people think.
It's a massive platform of flavour to play with.
Yeah.
The range is incredible. You've got everything from as light as a Pinot Grigio in style to as rich and bold as a Barossa Shiraz.
Does it have to be an old age to be good?
No, not at all. It's not. It's certainly not how you should purchase your whiskey. Within our range, and one of the things that people don't realise is that within our range of whiskies, 12, 15, 18, 21, 26, we have, I think at the moment we've got 90 different whiskies on the market. Most people think we have a green one, which upsets me. I don't like Glenfiddich. Oh, really? Which ones have you tried? Well, the green one. Okay, yeah, that's a huge broad spectrum of our portfolio you've gone through there. The green one.
It's just a colour.
So, and then you look at the range and you see age statements on them. Yeah. They are not verticals in the same way you would do wine. So you can sit down with wines and go through each annual vintage, and you will see a progression in style and age, because it's the same product grown exactly the same way. The terroir has influenced it in some way, and then there's age. With our whiskies, our 15-year-old is not 3 years older than the 12. It's a completely different character in how it's made as well. And therefore, within our range, there will be some that people say, I really like this one, I'm not so keen on that one, that one's great. For myself, 26-year-old is one of my go-tos if I can afford it. The 15, the 12, Project 20, but the 21 and the 18 are quite sweet whiskies. And I'm not really a sweet whiskey drinker. I prefer a bit of spice, a bit of savoury note coming from it. So there are whiskies within the portfolio, irrespective of age, which I will go. In fact, our Project 20 has no age on it whatsoever.
So you moved away from age completely then?
Well, age statement's a funny thing. If we go back to the 60s, when we launched the first single malt commercially, there was no age statement on it. And in fact, the first time an age... Well, there's a slight diversion here. The first time an age officially appeared on a bottle of Glenfiddich, there was a period in the 70s, it said over 80 years old. That was all it was. And we took it off. So there was a 60s to 70s, no age statement, a small age statement from the 70s to 80s, then 80s and 90s to 2000s, no age statement, Glenfiddich. All of it. We had the first time a number 12 appeared on the bottle was in 2000. And yet, so most of the people, again, that 30% that I speak to that say you shouldn't do this and shouldn't do that, they say, I'm not drinking it, it doesn't have an age statement on it. But you actually hear people say that. I'm not drinking that, it doesn't have an age on it. I'm like, what is wrong with you? Why would you go around the world such a blinkered view of life? Yeah. Well, how old is it? It's tasty old, that's what it is. Just it's tasty old.
So instead of just saying open-minded, you know what, send it over, I'll have a little try of this, and still try and maybe be right in his own mind because he wants to say to you it was no good because there was no age statement.
Yeah.
This person is just blocking it off.
Yeah, absolutely. And then they'll say to you, I don't drink it. And I say, well, do you know I've drunk Glenfiddich all my life. And you're thinking, well, right, so the 80s, the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s didn't have... up until 2000, didn't have an age statement on it. No, it didn't. No, that's wrong. And I have to get the picture out. I keep the picture purposely of all the bottles lined up with all the dates underneath them. And I'll show them, look, he goes, yeah, that's the one I used to drink there. I said, there's no age on it. This doesn't say it. It says pure malt or special reserve.
You've doctored it now.
He's like, oh, right, okay. So again, that's just that attitude that people think it's got to have an age because that gives... Don't get me wrong, if you do want to exist in a world where you only go for the age statement, crack on. Who am I? You know, if that's how you want to live your life, that's fine.
But if they're honest with themselves, that age statement doesn't make it taste better. It tastes different.
Yes.
But it doesn't taste better.
And there is a point in a cask as well. There aren't so many of these out there. When whiskey gets very, very old, the cask takes over slightly. So that it becomes...
It's quite woody almost.
Yeah.
I was listening to doing some research on this, and she goes, the girl says, you know what, that's for a select few people who actually like to taste the wood. Like, you know, it's very dry, very woody. Like, it doesn't sound something like I'd want to do. But I know when you talk about this, and this takes on to our next topic slightly, but you say that it's mostly he. And you find that more women are starting to drink whiskey, and is it mostly men with the preconceptions? Like...
You've hit the nail on the head. Not that more women are... It's men with the preconceptions. Because they perpetuate this masculine world of the whiskey drinker. Yeah. Which actually is a load of rubbish. You know, there was... In history, there's been lots of female distillers, master blenders, malt masters, in the industry itself. And then outside the consumers, it hasn't been... I know a lot of female whiskey drinkers, a lot, that have grown up with their mum or their gran or their aunt drinking whiskey. I think maybe over the last 20 years, there has been a direct change or a more obvious change with the increase in cocktails, availability and quality of cocktails. If you look at your average bar, actually a recent thing that came out which surprised me, your average top 10 best-selling cocktails in bars in the UK, and none of them were whiskey cocktails. But I think the bars that they take the surveys from are potentially not great cocktail bars. Yeah. When you look at the top 10 cocktails being things like woo-woos and cosmopolitans and Sex on the Beach, you're thinking, wow, there's still places that exist to create these. Then you take the world's best 50 bars, so the best 50 bars in the world, and you look at their top 10 selling drinks, and they're short, stirred down old fashions, Negronis, martinis, which don't feature
drinks, not a sweet.
Yeah, they don't feature at all on the top 10 selling drinks in Britain. But if you take the top 50 bars in the world, of which many of them are in the UK, then you start to see shorter cocktails. So people are moving away from those sweet drinks, which, let's face it, if you're drinking a woo-woo, you're not drinking it to taste the ingredients.
No, I don't think you want to taste the alcohol, do you?
No.
Or anything, actually. Yeah.
But a Negroni, it's got to be balanced right, and it's bitter and it's sweet at the same time, and the gin punches through if you get it right. An old-fashioned, big, bold drink, short, stirred down. So there's a change in people's palates because they're drinking less but drinking better and understanding the alcohols that are going into it.
After we met last time, I was sort of thinking about this, and I wondered if it's linked to the fact that more people eat dark chocolate. You know, they've got. I think we do have bolder palates today. I do wonder.
I think it's the availability of it. It was very difficult to get good quality dark chocolate in the UK unless it was cooking chocolate. So there's a massive shift in the availability of products, unusual products. And this, again, comes back to the bartenders creating incredible drinks with great product that are then becoming available to people. That walking into bars and thinking, what's this? This is a Negroni. Well, I've never heard of this. There's far more people drinking those shorter, stronger drinks. And then, of course, that is leading them toward experimenting with drinking the drinks neat. It's a short hop. You know, I didn't really like the guy that was drinking the old-fashioned at the beer show. I didn't really think I liked whiskey cocktails, but this is nice. Plus, you've got a neat whiskey in your hand. So it's the re-education through them finding out what their palate wants.
I was just on the women in whiskey topic. I was reading about a businesswoman in America, and they says, "Well, what's your favourite drink?" And she goes, "When I'm at a nice hotel, I always like to order a Lafroig on ice." Did I say that right?
Lafroig. Close.
Yeah, sorry.
It's okay. And I'll let you off.
and she says, the man next to her at the bar says to her, "Oh, is that for your husband? What are you having?"
Oof.
And she was just like, "This is my drink." Like, and it's quite peaty, isn't it?
Very smoky.
So, you know, so she was just like, he just walks away thinking, you know, he was obviously one of those people that then wanted to say, but she cut him off, and he was probably going to start saying, "Oh, you're doing it wrong," right?
Yeah.
You know, so it's just, I don't know, it's just this whole snobbishness over whiskey. But you don't see it with other drinks. I think I mentioned to you before, I was at an event recently and I was drinking whiskey, and at least 4 people said to me, "Oh, you know, look at you drinking whiskey." I don't know. Again, it just goes into...
I think they'd be surprised if I wasn't.
If they saw you with
There is... I mean, in anything you look at in life, there's a perception.
Yeah.
And whiskey's not a cheap product. If you're drinking it in a bar, it's pricey and you're getting a small measure. In Scotland, we managed to balance things out by doing something called a half and a half, which is a really, you know, if we walked down the road to the Roseburn in Murrayfield here, we'd probably find a few guys and girls at the bar drinking a neat whiskey and a half beer on the side.
Okay.
So and you'd alternate. It's not a depth charge or a Boilermaker. It's, you know, it's not a shot. You go back between one and the other. So
it's a way of just
exactly. Yeah. So, you know, whiskey can be expensive in bars. Although in Scotland we have a wonderful thing called Malt of the Month, which you can go on great tours of Edinburgh or Glasgow and find bars that have put on for the whole month one brand at a slightly reduced price. And people will come into the bar and just go, "I'll have a half pint of that and your Malt of the Month, please."
Oh, okay.
Irrespective of what it is.
Do you think because of the price and the bold flavours, do you think that people, if they're out on a night out, let's say, if we're generalising, would they drink less? Because you've got the bold flavours, which your brain is registering as, oh, you're drinking something.
Yeah.
You know, whereas if you're going towards the sweeter ones, the sweeter drinks, let's say, you're probably drinking them a lot faster, aren't you?
Yeah, I would say that. The shorter, more powerful, certainly in terms of the cocktails, I would think you would drink less. And they feel stronger as well. So people are a bit more... Well, certainly the people I drink with, because we're in the business, we will moderate our intake because we know that they're punchy, and you're respecting the drink and the bartender as well a little bit, because, you know, if you throw a drink together that doesn't taste of anything because it's got so much sugar level in it, you're not really creating anything worthy of not worthy of respect. I have to be careful how I say that, but if a bartender's taking a lot of time to choose the right ingredients, get that balance right, then that drink could last you, without ice, because it'll melt, 15, 20 minutes. You know, so that's a nice pace to drink a short drink at, maybe even longer. Of course, I don't go out very often in pubs on a Saturday night. I spend my time Monday to Thursday in pubs or bars or venues or restaurants. And I find them quite busy. I'm old, so I like to hear the conversation I'm having with the person. I don't want to be waiting.
You've got to the age where you're more a gentleman club.
Oh, well, ladies are welcome, of course. Yeah, I find that environment I'm just like, oh, get me out of here.
Yeah, it's just too busy.
Yeah, or I'll have a beer. If it's that type of night, I'll just have a beer. If I'm having a whiskey, I want a seat. I want to sit and have a conversation with someone. Yeah. I want to relax and find out, or a whiskey cocktail. I'll sit at the bar. Very often you'll find me at the bar speaking to the bartenders, just because it's a slow night.
So you'll have a beer, because that's baby whiskey.
Yeah. Or sherry, whiskey light.
I was reading an article recently, and it was about Pernod Ricard, and there was a couple of staff members that were saying that they were forced to drink more. And it was a recent article, and it made me think, like, what's it like working for a company that makes whiskey? Are there any sort of expectations? And then secondly, how do you balance your personal life, your health and everything by being an ambassador for a whiskey company?
Well, first off, there's absolutely no pressure within the business to drink. Absolutely none whatsoever. It's a family business. There's a lot of support in the company, health and well-being. Quite often, if I'm doing an event, I'll make sure I'm not drinking, because you could be doing 5 events that week, and that is just not good for anyone's health. And actually all the ambassadors, irrespective of whether they're the whiskey ambassador for us, or we have Hendrick's Gin in our portfolio as well, Sailor Jerry Spiced Rum, Reka Vodka, Monkey Shoulder whiskies. All the ambassadors are actually quite healthy, quite focused on balancing out their intake of alcohol and not burning out. I mean, they're all much younger than me as well, which is plays on their side. But there is no expectation to drink. We are good at what we do because I think we monitor how we do it. And we're all quite conscious of the downside of this industry and act accordingly to make sure that doesn't happen. We set a bartender program up called the 1887 Collective. And each ambassador selects from around the UK bartenders that we believe are career bartenders. So there's a lot out there now. People are in the bar industry and this is my career. Whereas in the past it was to pay the rent. So when we identify certain people in certain accounts, we invite them to be part of what's called the 1887 Collective, and we have them for a year, and it's a development program, but it's quite holistic. We do some trainings on our brands, we'll do cocktail competitions, we'll take them to distilleries, but we also take them to glamping sites and go foraging or whitewater rafting or team building things. So these are UK-wide people from the same industry but strangers at the start of the year, and then usually lifelong friends at the end of it. And we appreciate that what we're showing them is that yes, you can work hard behind a bar in this industry, but also there's a massive benefit to having a strong friends network and a healthy attitude towards how you live your life. And that's been, I think we're in our 4th year for the 1887 Collective now. It's massively popular. And it's a lot of fun as an ambassador to go in because you get, an opportunity to speak to this wonderful collective of young, energetic people about products, but also about balancing that life out a little bit. We've actually found a couple of our ambassadors from that very program, people that at the end of the year we've thought, wow, right, you've got your head switched on. This is when the roles have come up and been offered, they've actually been taken from that collective.
Well, it is worth noting to listeners that you're not a short, portly person with a very red face, and if anything, you're the complete opposite. You're quite healthy, and you are very aware of the downsides of the product that you're educating people on. It's interesting because I think that a lot of people would think that a company like that would want you to drink more, but actually it's all about being responsible. If I look at ambassadors, I've been following a few since I've started following you. If I look at their social media feed, it is very much a healthy mix of everything. Yeah. You've got them out walking with their dog. Well, you've got them, going to the gym or just being normal things. And then, but I think a lot of people would think, I bet they drink every night.
Don't get me wrong. It's a wonderful industry and it's a very social industry. It's very easy to go out every single night and have a drink. But it doesn't take long before you start to feel the effects of that kind of living that lifestyle. And I think if ambassadors that don't heed the warnings early enough on are usually either burnt out very, very quickly or actually their colleagues will pick them up on it. Yeah, and it's and help them out as well, because it can be a real issue. We work closely with a charity called the Benevolent, which is the hospitality charity, and I know 3 individuals that have been through the program there to help them out with addictions and depression. Because this is a terrible industry for it. But I think it's having things like the collective and having ambassadors that are aware, and we're starting to see a number of, or we're starting to see a far more open communication in the industry when it comes to things like alcoholism, depression, substance abuse, all these terrible parts of life.
Does whiskey age in a bottle? Because I think I told you I was in Cyprus last week. My dad had like loads of bottles. Like, he's got loads over here as well. He said, "Oh, these will be good because they've been in the bottle for like I've had them for 10 years and 15 years." So break that myth.
Yes, no, it doesn't age. Now there is a slight grey area in here. It doesn't age, absolutely not. If you've bought a 12-year-old Glenfiddich and had it in your cupboard for 10 years, it's not a 22-year-old Glenfiddich. It only gains age in a cask, and once it's in the bottle, it's stopped. Now, it was always thought that once in glass, nothing happened. But actually, with the advent of, or the increased availability of older bottles with things like whiskey auctions online, people have been buying up rarer bottles from 60s, 70s, myself included. I buy quite a lot of Glenfiddichs from there to use at trainings. And I have noticed that when you open them, there is a different aroma. Now, we're still trying to work out exactly what that is. We can call it bottle conditioning, not aging or maturing. Sometimes it's detrimental to the whiskey, but we think it's the airspace in the top just creating a chemical reaction. But the whiskey definitely has, and there's a few colleagues around the world that I've spoken with, if you were to line up 4 glasses of whiskey and 3 of them were manufactured within the last 2 years and opened that day, and one of them was manufactured 30 years ago and opened that day, we would be able to pick out the one that was the older one based on the age of the bottle, the age of the whiskey. There's a very distinct aroma comes out of it that we're all quite tuned into. I don't think for your average consumer in the street, people send me a lot of things saying, pictures going, "I've just found this in my grand's cupboard. Is it worth anything?" And of course, it's not, typically. And if it is...
If it was worth something then, it's worth something now.
Yeah. And I'm very open with them. I say, look, you'll get 50, 60 quid at auction for it, or you can open it and enjoy it and raise a glass to your gran.
My dad's also got like about 100 bottles of Bells that he's been given over the years.
I have no advice on just drink it.
No, it's true. Rather than looking at it as a way of profiting, almost, just like you're saying, it's just within reason. If you've got loads, don't. But just enjoy it.
There are huge collections out there, and whiskey is an investment piece as well. Like anything in the world, if enough people are interested in it, it has a value. And the rarer it becomes, or a particular bottle or bottlings, then the price goes up. I've got a collection of whiskies myself. I probably have around about 150 bottles open and about 200 bottles closed, and the closed ones are out of sight and stored away so that I can't open them because
keeping them up, it's too much effort.
It's just the fact that they're rising in value, and so I have that attitude that one day I'll open it up and go, I know what it's worth now, but I also know what I paid for it, so crack. And so that's why the girlfriends kept them
out of the way. Are there any sort of limitations with working for a company that not only is a family business, but is a 135-year-old family business?
I don't think there is. In terms of, the family have a very open attitude towards development, as all companies do. I think with the ambassadors, it's slightly different because, there's no grand ambassador role to move into. You're not like a junior apprentice ambassador, senior. There are other roles around the world that the company are quite happy to discuss if you ask for them. But for me, I'm a whiskey ambassador, and I'm back in Scotland now after 16 years, loving it. And I don't... it does annoy the company a little bit. I sit down with my bosses at each year, personal development plans, and, here's what to do for the next year. Where do you see yourself in 3 years' time? Like, right here doing this. No, we need, you need progression. No, I don't. I'm quite happy doing this. It is a strange one because any other job role will have something to move into. This is something you can move sideways with. I think initially when I had a brand manager a few years back who'd said, okay, so we've got a brand manager role coming up. And I said, what on earth do you think I would be interested in that for? Well, that's behind a desk, looking at numbers and spreadsheets all year. That's not what I do. And once we'd had that conversation, it was clear that they understood my career path was levelling out, which I'm absolutely happy with. I love what I do. And coming back to Scotland in the last 2 years, interestingly, Scotland's knowledge of whiskey is actually and I'll say this carefully, because it's on their doorstep, there is a large amount of whiskey drinkers in Scotland that take it for granted. So their knowledge is actually quite limited. Well, I remember doing a whiskey tasting in Warwick and asked this whiskey club in Warwick, of all places, who's been to Glenfiddich? And a few hands went up. Okay, who's been to whiskey distilleries in Scotland? And more hands went up. I did the same at a tasting in the centre of Glasgow for a big club, 60 people. 3 hands went up. And I said, wow, that's really surprising. I said, okay, who's been to Auchentoshan? That's the other side of Glasgow. 3 hands went up. And I was really surprised. So as an ambassador, it's great because all of a sudden you go to these whiskey clubs and they look at you and think, what are you going to tell me? Immediately I'm thinking, well, I clearly have a bit more experience than you, so this is going to be fun. It kind of puts them in their place because they love to ask geeky questions and show off, as we all do. So coming back up to Scotland, I just see this wonderful opportunity to educate, get out there, have fun, drink whiskey with people, have conversations about it, relight that fire and bust some myths.
So when you're doing like these events, so let's say there's like 10 people there and someone asks a genuine question, is there like always one person that's like trying to butt in? And
yeah,
there's
always. The skill is to introduce them quickly to the fold and make sure they're aware that you're aware and acknowledge and respect their information that they have contained in their head, but just keep it under wraps. So you get lots of people that are like, but isn't that about, oh, that's great, yes, you really know your stuff. Yeah. So
you've given them a little pat on the back.
Yeah, and then they become part of it. So if someone else asks a question later on, it's like, oh, what's your thoughts on that? Yeah. And they're like, oh, I'm part of this now. Yeah. I don't need to show off.
They feel like your deputy almost.
Yeah.
Does whiskey have to be expensive to be good?
No. It's a strange one again because obviously whiskey is expensive if you look at the product, but people take it for granted. It's Glenfiddich 12-year-old, it's taken 12 years before we can do anything with it. Obviously we're in a fortunate position as a company that's been around for 132, 133 years, where we have a huge amount of stock to draw down from. But if you think of a new distillery just starting out, and when William built the distillery in 1887, it cost him £775 for everything. You're looking at probably north of £2.5 million now to build a distillery of any scale.
And that's just to build the distillery. That's not to make your first lot of stuff and then hold it for 12 years.
Exactly. Yeah. You've got to get that money back, which is why a lot of them will release a gin to start with. And then once their stock is matured enough, they can pull something else out. But it's an expensive commodity and it deserves a bit of respect. But when it starts to get... I had this conversation recently with someone actually. At what point is the break-even of value to flavour? So I've bought some quite expensive whiskies in my time, mostly to stick away. I think I would say £200 a bottle is my limit in what I'm going to open. We start going northward of that and it's not going to be worth that money. It's rarity. If a bottle is £5,000, it doesn't mean the liquid tastes like a £5,000 whiskey. Some of the best whiskies I've ever had have been because of situation. A simple dram at the top of a Munro with friends after a hike, or a sunny day sitting at the side of a river. For me, these are the moments that make whiskey far greater than just the product itself. And I think that's why whiskey holds such mystique around the world, which can be snobbish, but it's a point of celebration. Initially it was a gathering of clans. It was people getting round and celebrating something really simple, like the end of a harvest or winter over, which is usually often celebrated in Scotland. So those whiskies don't have to be expensive, but they can be the most memorable.
What's worth noting is that if somebody wants to just have a Glenfiddich 12 or whatever it is they like I told you I enjoy Strathisla. It's not the most expensive whiskey, it's £35. It's not like, just enjoy it. It doesn't have to be, if you fancy going out and having a bit of a blowout, then have that £200 one sitting in the corner somewhere that you'll have one every now and then.
That's it.
Because that bottle might last you a year, 2 years, that one. There is, again, that probably goes back to a little bit of, people looking up down at the end of their nose at that.
Yeah. It's very difficult to quantify how prices get onto these things.
The difference with whiskey, though, as well, and again, it goes back to looking at doing some research when I was doing it earlier, and it was like, you can literally drink gin and vodka straight out the still.
Yeah.
Whereas with whiskey, you probably can, but not legally.
Well, no, you can, but
you can't
can't call it whiskey until it's been in cask for 3 years. Scotch.
So I think that, for straight away, you've got at least 3 years worth of storage fees there, and if you go into 12, you've got 12 years of storage fees. So, that costs money holding it there. And then you've got staff that are constantly doing other jobs. To be fair, if you think of all of that, you almost think, I don't know, what would a 12 be costing these days?
At Glenfiddich 12? Yeah, about 37.
Yeah.
So
when you look at all that effort that's gone into it over all those years, moving it around, making sure it's okay, lots of tasting. It's like, how many times does that barrel get handled? So actually, it does probably represent good value in some respects.
Yeah, there's a lot of duty. If we paid, we have 1 million casks in the distillery. I was trying to work out the volume of liquid and then try to get a mean average of age and stock levels and the size of casks. But I think if we sold every cask that was in the warehousing just now, we would have to pay Her Majesty £5.2 billion in duty.
Yeah. So essentially, the government is your business partner in some ways. Yeah. And then they penalise you at the same time.
But they do drink whiskey, so they're fine.
Oh yeah, of course, that makes sense. So then, you've just launched a new product, the Grand Cru.
Yep.
Tell us a little bit about that.
It's a fabulous product, and that's what had taken me to Lagos and Belgium, doing some launches for them across there. It's a 23-year-old whiskey, which has been matured in both American and European oak. It's a small amount of European oak. And then after its 23 years, we've taken that parcel of whiskey and rested it for a short period of time in quite rare French cuvée wine casks. Now, there's a number of things. That cuvée wines are the wines that will go on to become champagne in bottle. Most champagne houses will buy their wines direct from their growers and take it to bottle for second fermentation. But some of the champagne houses take those wines and, in the interim period, rest them in French oak casks. French oak is beautiful. It's quite difficult to work with, I've been told. I'm not a cooper, but the guys have told me it's a difficult product to work with. It delivers quite an unusual flavour, almost somewhere in between a European cask and an American cask. It's fruity sweet, but there's still a bit of spice to it. And we've managed to get hold of some of those casks once the cuvée wines have been disgorged from them. And we've put this 23-year-old Glenfiddich into there for a short period of time. And what it does is it takes what's already a delicious whiskey and makes it something quite outstanding, because it's adding in some of the other elements that not only that French oak cask has, but the previous contents of those French oak casks. So it's called a finish if you move whiskey into a secondary cask to gain some influence from there for a short period of time. That's known as a finished product. In fact, William Grant & Sons were the first company to really do that back in the 1980s with Balvenie, finishing a sherry cask, which later became Founder's Reserve, which then, when the age statement came on, was Balvenie Doublewood 12, which is a fairly well-known product. So we were the first people to utilise that process commercially. And Grand Cru is an extension of this with 23 years. It's a great age of a product as well. Delicate, interestingly. A lot of our product goes through American oak, and people do comment that it's very light, and because American oak, white oak, doesn't leach a lot of dark colour. Your European cask does that. But with Glenfiddich, and I know I gave you a small nose of new make spirit earlier, it's quite a light, grassy product when it comes off the still. And if we utilise sherry casks heavily, that delicacy is masked. There are other wonderful sherry cask whiskies out there. Glenfarclas is very close to us geographically. Macallan just across the river as well. Aberlour just down the road. These are predominantly sherried whiskies, and the spirit handles that very well. They're known for that. But at Glenfiddich, we are a lighter, more delicate product. And at 23 years old, the Grand Cru is actually quite pale. It looks not dissimilar to an oaked Chardonnay that you might expect. Golden, amber. The flavour is superb. It lingers, soft, creamy palate. It's actually been very well received. And that's part of a new range that we're bringing out. So we have our experimental series whiskies, 4 in the range, IPA, Fire and Cane, Project 20, Winter Storm. We have our core range, we call our core products, 12, 15, 18, 21, 26. And then now we have our grand range. So there's a new product coming out in 2020, which I can't talk about, unfortunately, which will be joining Grand Cru as a partner, and there'll be a third whiskey coming into that group as well, which will be quite an elevation into the sort of luxury market for Glenfiddich.
So do you see that that's probably where the industry's going a bit? Because if we look at your whiskies are actually, especially experimental, they're different. They're not just a fancy bottle in a fancy box. These are they're very different recipes, and they've been blended very differently. Because I think you see them at the airport all the time, don't you? All fancy box. They were just charging a bit more for it, but this is just completely different to that, isn't it?
Yeah, I think there's always going to be a market there for high-end rare whiskies. I think what we've got with the Grand series is a set of whiskies which give people a chance to indulge, something to celebrate. Then it's an opportunity to open one of these bottles. The liquid is rare and exceptional, and there's a certain joy comes from drinking something like that with people. I don't think Grand Cru is something that you would sit down and particularly drink on your own. It's almost a sharing whiskey because of its very essence. Our 21 Grand Reserva is more of a gifting product. That's the sort of, you've done something well, here's a gift from me to you. Grand Cru is about sharing, and the third product I think will be more if you personally do something quite wonderful and want to reward yourself. I think the third product that comes out in 2020 will be more along those lines. So yes, there's so many different levels of whiskey drinker, from your everyday value product on the shelf to those that will only ever seek out an age statement, to those that will experiment and try something different and break from the norm. IPA Project 20, not interested in or not encumbered by the rules and regulations, free spirits, free thinkers. And then we elevate up into a slightly more luxurious world where, as we go up into the 40s and 50s, the prices obviously go through the roof, but they're very rare products. But then we're living in a world now where there are individuals out there that I know, not personally, but I know they'll drink a Glenfiddich 30 every month. Now that's a £650 bottle of whiskey. That is the world they live in. They treat themselves and go through a bottle every month because they can afford it. They're successful. That to them is somebody else's bells.
Yeah, exactly. There's different levels, isn't there? That probably to some degree perpetuates the snobbishness. However, but again, it's horses for courses, what people can afford, isn't it?
Yeah.
And if they can afford it, then why not? Do you sort of see that type of luxuriousness with vodka and gin?
It's always been there with vodka a little bit, I think.
Yeah.
There's always been.
But is that because the product itself is better, or is it just because the bottles?
I think the bottles and the marketing that went around it, and plus there's more individuals drink vodka than whiskey.
Yeah.
So it's an easier market.
Because you do see, I think you do see this sort of, whether it's elegance or betterness with brandy. I think you see it there a little bit.
Yeah.
I think
Brandy's an interesting one. Cognacs have always had this idea of luxury.
Is it because of the wording?
Well, I think the French are just very good at blowing their own trumpet sometimes. Us Scots have not been very good at it, especially the Grant family. I think we've
very understated, maybe.
Yeah, we've, as I say, going back to individuals that say I've tried the green one. We've never really. Our bottles of 50-year-old Glenfiddich, there's very few ever make it into the UK. They go into the hands of individuals straight away in America and Asia. Or we sell them to people like Harrods. Harrods will take one. We don't actually know where they end up, it sounds strange, but if we sell to Harrods, they sell to their customer.
And it remains private.
Exactly, which is cool. But I think our attitude slightly now is sort of to stand back and think, well, we've got all this old, aged liquid, and we've not really done anything with it. I mean, if you think, I said 1 million casks, but an average distillery will hold 200,000. So when you think of the level of stock we have and the age of stock we have, there's going to be quite a shift in how Glenfiddich talk about themselves over the next few years.
What's the oldest sort of whiskey you guys have got in barrels?
Oh, I can't tell you.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Like, so you said 50. There must be something older than that.
Yeah, we've released 64-year-old whiskies before, so we.
So that's as far as you're willing to say then.
Yeah.
64. Wow. It's interesting. And if it tastes nice as well, not like wood.
Well, actually, that's the interesting thing. Because we're family owned, that's how we've amassed such a great stock level. It's not that we get to the end of the year and suddenly have to pay shareholders. The family are the shareholders.
There's no pressure there to do silly things, let's say.
So casks will come via David Stewart initially when he was our malt master, but Brian Kinsman now. And they're assessed for quality on a regular basis. And those, no one puts spirit into cask on one day and says that's going to be our 50-year-old. Because you've absolutely no understanding of what that cask is going to do. That cask could tip that whiskey out in 10 years' time and be done. So those casks that are 40 and 50 years old tend to have been ones that, as Brian will have been setting aside casks for 12-year-old or trying to get that assembly of casks. He'll find ones he's thinking, that's actually not done much. That's just sat quietly. There's not much come out the cask yet. So, and by that I mean the flavour, the character. So let's stick that back in the warehouse. And that might come out on rotation now and again, and he'll try it again. Oh yeah, it's still sitting quietly. Now it might make it to a 20-year-old or a 30 or a 40, in very rare occasions 50s, and then even rarer beyond that. But it all comes down to the stock management, Brian's palate.
So is there different parts of the warehouse where you know, higher, lower, deeper, where does it have different effect on the whiskey?
There is, but we tend to move them around quite a bit anyway.
Yeah.
The old dunnage warehouses, certainly, which are quite small, dumpy, slate roof, stone walls, soil floor, they have pockets within them, which are sweet spots, or it could even be the fact that one's near a door, so there's a lot of foot vibration, which, you know, even though the casks are heavy, if a forklift is rumbling past outside,
just a little shake.
That little shake will speed up the maturation a little bit.
So soil floor, is that to keep the moisture right?
They'll sit at a constant temperature and the moisture will be fairly stable. We have had dry periods. Last year was quite difficult. I had 6 weeks with no rain at all, which is actually a big issue, because up there we need a lot of water to just have production.
And just explain to people about the angel share.
So it's a lovely term. When we fill a cask, when we take the spirit from the still, as I say, it's usually around about 71-72% ABV. We take our cask, whether that be American oak or European oak, and we will fill it normally around about 6 to 8% ABV. So we'll add a little bit of water, fill the cask, roll the cask into the warehouse. Now, an American oak cask, 220 litres, say, sits in the warehouse. Over time, there's an evaporation, quite a small amount. We're quite lucky. We lose about 1% per annum, 0.5% alcohol, 0.5% actual liquid. So after 10 years, you're going to have about 5% of your whiskey lost into the air. The alcohol's lowered slightly as well, so it'll have gone from 6 to 8 down to perhaps, in 10 years, probably about 63% ABV, 62. It could be lower. There could be, again, positioning in the warehouse. The cask could give up quite a bit, and it's called the angel share. Typically, when we then take the whiskey from the cask, it's at what we call natural strength, so whatever's happened to that cask, it's naturally dropped down. We will then add back in some spring water, which is the same water we use all through process, our Robbie Dew spring, which is the same one William found in 1886. We've still used it today. We'll add some water in, which will increase the volume of liquid but decrease the ABV down to, in the case of our 12-year-old, 40%, which is the minimum requirement for whiskey. If it drops below that, it can no longer be called whiskey. So that gives us our volume back and also brings the whiskey down to a more palatable and manageable strength.
This 8 rounds of flavour.
Yeah. However, if you get a single cask whiskey, they're very often left at cask strength, which is whatever has happened to that cask, they bottle it.
Oh, okay.
No additional water added. So you'll see some quite high strength whiskies out there. And they tend to be more of a connoisseur's thing, where people, because the interesting thing with them, people pay a lot of money for them. But the interesting thing is they're a snapshot that can never be repeated. So let's say you get 195 bottles out of that American oak cask after 12 years. Cask strength, single cask. Those 195 bottles are now unrepeatable. So even if you fill the cask again, it's going to give a different flavour out because you've extracted some of the elements from it. The ABV will shift differently. It'll just never be the same. So people pay quite a bit of money for these single cask strength bottlings. And I've fallen in love with a lot of bottles and got to the bottom of them and thought, I don't want this to end because I can't buy another one.
Yeah.
So it's quite strange. You get taken in by this.
In a weird sort of way, if we were to just flip it on its head a little bit, does that not give you a little bit more respect for someone like, and I don't want to be calling them out, but like Bells and Teachers, where they're making something the same time in and time out?
Yeah.
Like, because there's people that say, I've always drunk Bells because it's always the same. And I think that must be hard in itself, or not?
It's very hard. Brian, our malt master, will have the same issue with 12-year-olds because, as I say, he's probably bringing together about 500 casks at a time. He'll do 200 cask samples in a day, not drinking them. He actually waters them down. He adds quite a bit of water. In fact, this is one of the other myths that comes out about how much water to add. There's no rule. Every whiskey reacts differently, and every person will react differently to the level of water you put in, if at all. So I'm not a fan of water in anything in our core range unless it's Project 20, which is at 47% ABV. So it needs a dash for my personal taste. Brian he'll take his whiskies down to about 20%, these are the samples, 20% ABV, because he said at that level, it's easier to pick up a fault because you've basically dialed everything down. So what he's doing is taking those 200 samples and very quickly nosing each one, and his brain is registering good, different, and he'll put the different one aside. So the ones that he's picked quickly, they'll go, that's fine, that's gone off to 12-year-old. So he's pooling these together, making sure all those will work. And the ones that are left behind are the ones he'll go back into and go, that was interesting. Not a fault, but just something different that's caught his attention. And he'll make notes about that, and that might go back into the warehouse. And in time, in the future, he may be putting something together and thinking, I know what this needs. It needs that whiskey it's got that character. Right, let's, type. Up comes the cask number, sends a warehouseman out to get it, brings a sample, puts it down, puts it into whatever he's creating. Bingo. So there's a real skill. Now, for our consistency, most companies will bring together, when they're bringing their casks together, they'll be using quite large stainless steel silos, 60, 70,000 litres. Ours are oak and only 2,000 litres. So with our 12-year-old, we get the casks ready. We assemble a 2,000 litre vat of 85% 12-year-old American oak, 15% 12-year-old European oak, and we fill the vat and we leave it there for 6 months, just to let the casks and the whiskey get to know each other before it goes into bottle. Now, that's an extraordinary length to go to for a product such as 12-year-old. We do the same with our 18-year-old, and if you look closely at the bottle of 18, it will actually say small batch reserve, because quite rightly, 2,000 litres is a small batch, and they're created in 2,000 litre lumps before and perfected before going into bottle. But it surprises a lot of people to know that we do exactly the same process with our 12-year-old, which people look at it because it's so ubiquitous and so readily available, they see it as a factory mass-produced product. I suppose technically, yes, it is, but there's still elements introduced all the way along. The human element of Brian Kinsman, the family element of whether it's good enough to go out into the world, the warehouseman, the selection of casks, the vatting of this 2,000 litre lot before bottling after 6 months. It's an incredible process just to get that 12 out. And yet, yes, it is the world's biggest selling single malt.
Why is a good whiskey selection important for like a hotel, bar, restaurant? Sometimes you go there and you just see 2. And then other times you go there and you see 30. What's your thoughts behind that?
Well, it's a rising market. Gin is still on the up. But what I'm hearing from a lot of venues across Scotland is that they're rationalising their gin selection because there's so many. And actually, it's quite interesting because whiskey's actually done it the opposite way around. In the past, bar owners will open a bar up and they will tick list down the wholesalers, think, right, that's my whiskey list done, with no thought. Not everyone, obviously, but no thought and consideration there, really. It's really important if you're going to entice a new whiskey drinker to have the right kind of range behind the bar. It doesn't need to be a lot. Within 8 bottles, you can nail it. You've got a range of styles and flavours, prices, not regionality. We really need to get away from talking about whiskies and regionality. Speyside, Highland, Lowland, Islands, it's rubbish. It's rubbish. I'm glad I can put it on record. The modern whiskey industry has moved into such a fast-flowing, flexible business that a distillery like ourselves, Glenfiddich, can produce a smoky whiskey and have done with Fire and Cane. We used to be a peated whiskey until 1933. Early 30s, we were still a smoky whiskey. Most of Scotland would have been because it was the fuel of choice to dry your barley before any alternate fuel sources came in. So why do we still talk about regions and pigeonhole? If you look at wine lists in bars, they tend to, some, obviously, if we're talking one with a sommelier, it will be a very different situation. But if you're looking at your average bar on the street, the wines will be arranged in light and floral, rich and spicy, bold. And why don't we do that with whiskey? Because we can travel around Scotland and find similar styles of whiskey from all 4 corners of it. But we insist on pigeonholing. Now, here's a good example there. Islay. Classically known as a smoky whiskey island, except 2 of the distilleries, Bruichladdich and Bunnahabhain. And for years, I've always thought it a bit of a shame because if people have a small amount of information about whiskey and they know that Islay means smoky, or Isla, as is often mispronounced, they'll flick through a whiskey menu and they'll see Islay and they'll just turn the page completely. I don't like smoky whiskies. And yet in that island, something like Bunnahabhain 12-year-old is delicate, salty, coastal, not peated. That, for me, can often be, well, it is limiting. If someone comes in and says, I don't drink Speyside whiskies, we miss out. But if they say, well, I like light, delicate, fruity American oak cask whiskies, then that's Glenfiddich. So I think we offer a service with our team if there's a bar opening up where we can go in and work with them from the ground up, curate their whiskey list, which isn't just all our product, as many people think, but we actually bring in other brands and create a well-rounded selection that your whiskey novice can walk in and be guided through, or your whiskey expert can come in and be enticed because it's actually an interesting lineup.
I think I mentioned to you earlier about a friend of mine who's just opened a restaurant and he wanted all like local small craft, etc. And a customer of his was asking for Jack Daniels, and he ended up hiding it in the speed rail, and he was like, I don't want other people to see that. And I was thinking, but I think in a few weeks he went through quite a bit of it, and I'm sure the customer paid handsomely for it. Yeah. But it's just like, what's your thought process behind that? People that, where they've got, I don't know.
Don't build your bar for yourself, build it for your customers. Have a theme, have an outline and an idea of what you want to head towards, but there's always going to be a customer asks for that. Unless you can be clever enough and have a range where you can say to someone, okay, I understand why you like that. Mm-hmm. Let me give you this alternative. Try this.
You've got to really know everything about every whiskey.
There was a great bar still is, the Big Easy in Covent Garden when it first opened. Had a fabulous selection of whiskies in it. And I remember walking in one night, I was with a distiller from the States, and we were sitting having a whiskey at the bar, and a young lad walked up and asked the barman, and we are talking maybe 300 bottles behind the bar of world whiskies, single malt Scotch, everything. And he said to the bartender, do you have Jack Daniel's honey? And the bartender said, no, I'm sorry, it's not something we stock here. And the guy went, oh. The bartender said, but if it's that slightly sweeter profile you're looking for, let me show you a couple of things we do have that you might like. And he ended up with other bourbons with a slightly sweeter profile, which were probably going to cost him the same price as his JD honey was going to be anyway. And it was quite an interesting conversation I saw happen across the bar. And the guy said, I've never heard of any of these before. And the bartender said, well, how much? He said, I only ever drink JD honey. It's the thing that got me into it. Nice sweet profile, of course. There were quite a lot of people jumped on that. But what I saw the bartender then do is take him through just the next couple of steps of education there to say, right, I see why you like that, and we're going to keep those flavour profiles, but we're just going to take you on a little journey. And by the end of it, the guy was great. This is brilliant. I love this. What next? What could I go next? Now, if that bartender hadn't had that conversation or the opportunity, that would have just been another JD and honey over the bar, probably with Coca-Cola as well. So it's quite an interesting... If you have to have a decent range, but you've got to have the knowledge. We did some work with a fabulous hotel up in Glencoe, and it was newly refurbished and opened, King's House Hotel. And the staff were all quite new, and it's quite a remote area. It's in the middle of Glencoe, stunning property. And the staff were all very new, and I was up there to train them all before opening. And they had around about 100 bottles of whiskey behind the bar. And I was trying to we did our portfolio tasting and range, and I was trying to guide them through quite a lot of the things on the back bar as well. And it occurred to me that their biggest fear was just they knew this was a whiskey destination place. They knew that was quite a good range, but they knew very little about it. So I said, right, okay, let's try this. So there are 2 shelves. And the top shelf I set up, irrespective of brand, region or age, the smokiest style of whiskey to the least smokiest style of whiskey, but still smoky. And then on the shelf below, we went from American oak, so your lightest style, to your big heavy sherry casks, European oak style whiskies at the other side. And I said, now, that looks really confusing because they lumped all the brands together. I said, if your customer comes in, that's going to be quite confusing for them. And they said, yeah, well, how are we supposed to know what's what? I said, okay, think about this. If a customer comes in and is looking at your shelves and cannot see their brand, because ordinarily you'd lump them all together so they're easily identifiable, then they're going to ask you for help. Oh, do you have X? Yes, we do. It's here. Oh, what's that next to it? That I've never noticed before, because next to it is usually the next age statement up in that brand's range that the customer already knows. Now, because of the way they're set up, that bottle to the left and to the right of the customer's choice is close. So then the member of staff has an opportunity to say, oh, you'll like it.
Yeah, because it's not a big reach, is
it?
Yeah,
they don't need to know what that bottle is. They don't even need to like whiskey. The way it was set up was to do that. If you want to try something really different, Mr. Guest or Mrs. Guest, they go 2 bottles to the left or 2 bottles to the right. And as long as they put them back in the right order, which is easy because you put a number on the bottom of the bottle and a number on the shelf. And I went back about 7 months after so after their season. And the same setup was still there. And apparently it'd been really helpful for the staff.
I'd really like hot sauce, and they're generally numbered 1 to 10, 10 plus. Like 10 plus being, it's going to blow your face off. But I generally like anything around an 8.
Yeah.
And I know that, I'm not sure how many Scoville units it is, but I know that an 8 is where I'm at, 9 sometimes, but I like 7 all the time. And what you're saying makes complete sense, because you could say if it was numbered, I like 8. But I think, I wouldn't be offended by a 6 and I wouldn't be offended by a 10.
Yeah.
But then if you fancy being really out there, you could say, well, I'm going to have something from the other side.
Yeah, and it just helped the staff. That was the thing. Because one of the things I don't like to hear, but I hear far too often, is when you walk into a bar and you say, well, I'm going to have a whiskey. Oh, I'll just get the person that knows about whiskey. Like there should only be one person in the bar. But what, do you have a vodka expert as well? And a gin expert? And I'd like to find me your tonic sommelier, please. Bring them to me right now. I don't understand this whole thing of let me get the expert.
The people that we spoke about earlier.
Yeah, they are. Yeah. They're frightened.
What they really mean is we've got someone that knows how to deal with people like
yes, yeah, potentially. I don't think there'd be anyone out there that if they were looking to have a whiskey and the person went, I don't know about whiskey. I'd much rather, if I walk into a place and say, I'm after a whiskey. I'm not a whiskey drinker, but I'm happy to help you. Great, because that's what you're here to do. That's your job. And this whole thing about having a whiskey expert, because again, it puts the whiskey up on this pedestal. Explore it, drink it, smell it.
I think I told you, me and my brother-in-law and the family went to a restaurant in a hotel in Bristol, near Bristol, and it's called The Pig. And afterwards for dessert, we said we'll have a whiskey. And we said to the barman who was serving us, we want to order some whiskey. And he goes, bear with me, my colleague's just on a course. So she, and I don't think it was from a snobbiness point of view. I think she genuinely just wanted to hone her skills. And she was really excited about it. We ended up with a hibiki, I think. I can't remember. It must have been that. And she really went through it all, and you could tell she was genuinely excited.
Yeah.
But
that's great.
Yeah,
that's great.
I suppose in some ways that does perpetuate the problem, though.
It's a vast subject.
Yeah.
But it doesn't need to be. And by that, I mean, no one walks into a bar and said, I'd like a whiskey from really tall stills, please. And I'd like a 72-hour fermentation. Do we have any of those? That's the kind of stuff you're like, why would you choose your whiskey that way?
I think the problem is when it's those, again, it's that type of person who, let's say they're like Lefroy, and they want to learn every single...
Well done, you got the pronunciation that time.
I thought about it this time. And they literally learn every single thing. And then they think that they like that whiskey because of all of those processes. So then they decide that they want to blurt it out to anybody who's willing to stand there and listen for 1 minute. So I think maybe that's the
whiskey
problem.
bores.
Yeah. Where do you sort of see the, just closing off now, where do you sort of see the whiskey market heading? More luxurious?
No, I think it's room for everyone. I think there's a shift, as I said earlier, from perhaps people who were blended whiskey drinkers moving into single malts, the category, which the blended market is declining slightly and malts are on the rise. Around the world, the level of growth in various markets is drastically different. So we're a very mature market in the UK and the US, but then if you go across to, as I said, I was in Nigeria, a burgeoning market. Just the level of knowledge is very, very low. But the enthusiasm for the product is incredible. So it was maybe 10 years behind the UK in terms of knowledge, which in some ways is absolutely brilliant because you're starting with a clean sheet.
None of these preconceived
Exactly,
ideas.
yeah. It's
unless there's that Nigerian guy that's walking around saying you're doing it wrong.
Yeah, there probably is somewhere. So yeah, I think it's a very healthy... No, well, that's the wrong word to use. The industry is in a very healthy state. Yeah. Whiskey is popular. There's some fabulous products coming out constantly. Some new distilleries. The amount of new distilleries that have come on in the last 5 to 7 years is incredible. It's the biggest growth since, was it the biggest growth since just after Prohibition, I think I've read recently. And people think, is there enough people out there to drink all this whiskey? Well, yes, there is.
Yeah.
There absolutely is. I think we might see, in the case of Glenfiddich, as we are seeing this, not rationalisation, but an understanding of where our products fit. And instead of it just being a long line of different products, we actually have compartments which are specifically created. And I think we'll see more of that from a lot of brands where, even now there's quite a few whiskies that we do that we just don't do in the UK. So they're specifically made for America or the Asian markets. And I think we'll see more of that occurring as we diversifying to different levels of the whiskey drinker.
This question was phrased as, what is your favourite whiskey? However...
Whatever one's in my hand at the time that I haven't paid for.
Have you got like an everyday one that you go to? Have you got one that you like as a special treat?
Yes, and yes, and yes. And my go-to whiskey is Glenfiddich 15. Hits the spot. Absolutely, just does not disappoint me anytime, no matter what mood I'm in. It's an absolute corker of a whiskey. I have moments where I seek out unusual whiskies. And if I'm in a bar and I see it, I'll drink it. Lost distilleries, things that are closed, independent bottlers, unusual casks. But that's the whiskey geek in me. Just wanting to be excited and do something slightly different, entertain me. Come on, whiskey, do something. There's lots of, as I mentioned earlier, there's lots of points in my life which have had certain whiskies which are key to that memory and therefore holds a certain special little place. In general, I'm a big whiskey drinker, so I'm quite happy to sit down and someone bring me something different and I go, this is great. Irrespective, you've no idea how old it is, how much it's cost, how rare it is, how...
You just want to take their word for it almost.
Yeah.
They've brought it to you, you like it, and you're willing to be delighted, or if not, if you don't like it, you're not going to make a big deal out of it though.
Yeah, I like being challenged and intrigued at the same time. And there's lots of whiskies will do that. I mean, that's the thing. There's so many now. I go round these whiskey shows and, goodness, I actually sometimes feel overwhelmed. I wonder how it must feel for a consumer that comes to a whiskey show and there's 2,500 people at it and, all these stands and different whiskies. And I walk around and I think, God, I've never seen this before. And when did that one come out? So it's
quite fast-paced.
Right now, it's incredible, which is great. It's a very healthy situation. No, I should stop saying healthy. It's not.
We know what you mean. Only adults listen to this anyway. But I guess they are. So, who would you love to have a dram with, dead or alive?
Oh, well, my grandfather, he lived till he was 106, and I managed to have a Glenfiddich with him about 6 months before he passed away, which was a really special moment for me. And it would be, of course, it'd be nice to bring him back and sit down with my dad as well and have a dram. My dad's not much of a whiskey drinker. He's quite interesting. I keep trying to force him into it, but
he's not having it.
He understands it. He's a gin drinker and a beer drinker. But I think, Oliver Reed, I was always quite fascinated by. I mean, quite a sad character, but I've read a couple of biographies on him, and he lived a fairly fast-paced life in a very fast-paced world at that time. I don't think he would fit in. He'd be quite like a dinosaur.
Yeah, probably.
But I going back into those old classic individuals, I think they'd be quite funny. I think he'd have a lot of good stories. Yeah. And whiskey and stories go so well together.
It's true.
It wouldn't be so much about having the dram; it'd be the evening you'd have with the whiskey. So I think somebody like Ollie Reed would be funny.
Where would be a good place? Whether I'm in London, Edinburgh, you choose to just go for a good drink. Not so loud. Great selection of drinks. Great knowledge.
Goodness, my head has just gone like a Rolodex. Well, there's a hello. That's the 1980s calling.
I'll just open my phone. Shall I?
So London, Black Rock. Every time I'm in London, it's got to be Black Rock. Small basement bar in. There's now one in Bristol as well.
Oh, great! My brother all of that.
Fabulous selection, and they've set their cabinets up exactly as it should be. 4 cabinets full of whiskies from all over the world, all types, arranged in light, fruity, rich, spicy, smoky, non-smoky. And you just go up and pick it out the cabinet yourself. There's no bar. Well, there isn't in the London one. Fabulous, love it. They have a...
Well, you pour it yourself?
You can hand it over to
the
bartender, for want of a better word, who will then pour it and bring it over to you.
It's like a room tender.
Yeah. It's fab. Like a butler. Which I'm not adverse to. Edinburgh. Now, this is the thing. You come up to Scotland. In London, you can pick out those bars really quickly. So modern, funky, do some cocktails, but it's all about the whiskey. Great atmosphere, great building. You come up to Glasgow, you're going to have to go into the Pot Still and the Bon Accord, which are 2 of the biggest whiskey collections in Glasgow. I think Frank's, who I was with last night, is basically approaching 600, maybe even 700 whiskies behind the bar. The knowledge is incredible. The atmosphere is brilliant. It's an old man's pub. It's right in the centre of Glasgow. It opens at 10 o'clock in the morning and there'll be boys in there drinking their pints of Tennent's. It's just an institution. Bonacord's the same. Stunning selection of whiskies, but really welcoming. Just a boozer. Then in Edinburgh, you can go through something like the Athletic Arms, or the Diggers as it's known locally, which isn't far from here, which is very similar to the Pot Still. Great whiskey selection, great staff, fun little boozer, no pretense about it at all. Wander into the middle of town, you're going to have to go to Uskubay or Nauticus down in Leith, who've got a really interesting selection of unusual bottles, or the Register Club, or Lady Libertine, or Scotch at the Balmoral, or the Calibar at the Waldorf Astoria. I can walk home from Arthur's Seat, and I can walk maybe for 7 minutes each time before I hit an absolutely stellar place that you'd want to stop in and have a drink.
In the winter, you need to.
Yeah.
You need to.
It's very important for survival. I actually did that when the Beast of the East came in last year. 3 o'clock in the afternoon, I got my hair cut at Grassmarket, and there was no traffic. Princess Street was a whiteout, and the storm was hitting really hard. And I thought, I'm going to have to get indoors here. So I managed to get across Princess Street Gardens from Grassmarket and dived into Uskubay. Basement bar, 400 and something whiskies, great selection. I've worked with the guys for years there now. And I said, I'm just sheltering from the storm. They're like, yeah, good idea. But in the meantime, I get a phone call from a friend who's also doing the same in another bar. Yeah. And I said, I'm going to brave it. So I finished there. I think we got in about 4:30 in the morning. Yeah. When we just stayed away until the storm died. Yeah. It was full 12 hours in Edinburgh, just wandering around whiskey bars.
Wow. Sounds like a great day, though, to be fair.
It was good. Yeah. We didn't drink in all of them. It was more about just getting out of the weather.
I see you're going to stick to that story.
Yes, yes. Responsible, of course. Always responsible consumption.
Well, that sounds good. Well, Mark, on that note, we'll leave it there. People can follow you on Twitter and Instagram? Or is it mostly Instagram? Where are you
mostly Instagram now. I think Twitter's... Yeah, I'm getting too old. It's too fast-paced. It's just people shouting anyway. I prefer Instagram.
At the moment,
Single Malt Mark. Single Malt Mark.
And I think you're right. There's only one place I can go at the moment where there's no political activity, and that's Instagram. Lots of whiskey, food. And,
it's funny when you go into my search bit on the front, things that come up, it's mostly tailoring, shoes, watches, whiskey.
Yeah, well, I did compliment you on your shoes.
Yeah.
You're a man about the world and all that.
I've got two looks when it comes to fashion: T-shirt and jeans, or good suits.
Oh, you see, I've got one. It's mostly scruffy. Yeah. Even when I wear a suit, it's scruffy.
It's been a pleasure. It's been really nice chatting with you.
We'll talk again soon.
Super. Thank you.